But first, President Trump was particularly active on Twitter over the weekend, and the increased frequency is usually a sign that he's concerned about something, nervous about something, maybe trying to distract. In this case, it's clearly the impeachment inquiry. Trump tweeted and retweeted 75 times over the weekend, up until just after midnight last night. Everything from retweets of the likes of Jeanine Pirro and Mark Levin praising a UFC fighter. He also attacked the whistleblower. The whistleblower got it so wrong that he must come forward. The fake news media knows who he is, but being an arm of the Democrat Party don't want to reveal him because there would be hell to pay. Reveal the whistleblower and end the impeachment hoax, to which Mimi Rocah labeled witness intimidation and retaliation, period. Trump also went after the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff. If Shifty Adam Schiff, who is a corrupt politician who fraudulently made up what I said on the call, is allowed to release transcripts of the Never Trumpers and others that were interviewed, he will change the words that were said to suit the Dems' purposes. Republicans should give their own transcripts of the interviews to contrast with Schiff's manipulated propaganda. House Republicans must have nothing to do with Shifty's rendition of those interviews. He is a proven liar, leaker, and freak. This is our president, who is really the one who should be impeached, to which Brian Klaas responded. Trump calls the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee a freak and invents yet another insane conspiracy theory, and it will barely be a story. That's where we are. Democracy erodes when previously unthinkable conduct becomes so routine that it's barely even noticed by voters. That was the warning, Mike Barnicle, real quick, that Madeleine Albright gave so early on in this presidency, especially with her book, Fascism, A Warning.
You know what's interesting is his comments about the releasing the transcripts. I mean, Steve, you would know this. A lot of people know this. The stenographer who takes down the transcripts, it's not a Republican transcript. It's not a Democratic transcript. It's a legitimate transcriber,
right.
A stenographer, an independent person. You're sworn that this is an accurate transcript that you're taking. And the idea that, the Republicans have a different transcript than the Democrats, absurd.
Yeah, no, it's not a partisan position, right?
Yeah.
No, the president even found time to attack a Purple Heart recipient who testified last week, labeling him a never Trumper and threatening to reveal proof. Look at this.
Sir, what evidence do you have that Colonel Vindman is a never Trumper?
We'll be showing that to you real soon, okay?
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.